Ready? Yeah. All right, good afternoon. So during the next hour, we're going to present the ops area. So I'm Benoit Claes, and this is my friend Joel Yeagley. We'll do the best to entertain you. So please ask questions, try to make it interactive. I thought it would be better that we present from here. We can have a look at the PC slightly to read the slides instead of reading the screen. So the thing with ops is that it's divided into two logical parts. On one side, we have like, how do we operate networks, right? With best practice, with network protocol deployment guidelines. So this is where the operators are involved. This is Joel's part. My part, and I will be starting with the first half an hour, is on managing networks, typically protocols and data models. So, you know, we've been doing MIP modules in SNMP for some time. We still do a couple of non-writable, read-only MIP modules. Today, just a few, yes. Yeah. So today we focus on Yang modules or Yang models for configuration with .conf and RESTconf. We've been doing historically like flow management with IPFix, a working group which is closed now. We're doing AAA as well, radius and diameter. AAA stands for Authentication, Authorization, and Accounting. So we're doing fault from FCAPs, fault, configuration, accounting, performance, even if IPPM is a transport working group, and also security from an operational point of view. So we heard that from the community that we are friendlier than we look. So and we're quite helpful. Yeah, which is good. Yeah. So typically, if you approach us, we're kind of friendly. So don't hesitate for questions. Now, so I mentioned ops. The ops area is operations and management. So typically what we have in the IETF is that we've got people defining specifications for technologies. Those people are not the one running networks. So it's important to get the operator feedback to say, well, this is the way that we should deploy IPv6 or BGP. So in this case, for example, at the bottom, there was a nice drawing. It's kind of weird now, so don't forget about the drawing. But basically, we've got a working group, which is a working group called IDR for BGP protocol specification. We've got another one which is called Secure IDR. Then whenever we take this into account and take the operator feedback coming from the NOC, network operator groups, then it feeds into typically an ops working group, GROW, which is about routing, global routing tables. And then this is where we define the best current practice and the guidelines. And then we go back into the working group if we need to define something else. Right, this is the feedback loop. Yep. Now, we'll be spending maybe one slide per working group describing what we do in there what the hot topics are. In 1 hour, it's not like a tutorial on, okay, what is SNMP, what is netconf, what is RESTconf, etc. But we're trying to give you pointers on what to pay attention to in working groups, specifically if you want to participate. So these are the working groups from Joel. So typically he's going to cover that, but benchmarking, DNS operations, global routing operations, multicast, operational security. We mentioned like CIDR operation for BGP operation, and IPv6, V6 ops as we call it, is quite an important working group here. It has been for years, it will be for years, I guess. Now, on my side of the house, on the protocols and data models, I've got a couple of working groups, and we're going to review them. There is netconf for netconf monitoring, netmod for netconf data model language. L3SM just closed. This is a service YANG model. I'm going to come back to that. And we open an L2SM for L2 VPN service model. I've got Lime that deals with OAM management, and SUPA to define policies. So I was quick. Don't worry, I'll come back with 1 slide per working group. What I want to show at the bottom here, this is my key message, is that we have 4 different working groups that are in the ops area. But if you look there, they're not managed by any of us, right? Typically, they would be working group in my part of the house, under the management. So we've got the AAA ones with Diameter, and with Radius, which is Radius extension, Radex. We've got one on autonomic networking, Anima, and one on LMAP, large-scale measurements of broadband performance. So why do we have ops working group not managed by the ops area director? It's not because we're just lazy and we gave working group away. We are lazy, but that's a different story. So here is what happened. 2 years ago already, the IESG, the Internet Engineering Steering Group, realized that we would have a lot of YANG models in the IETF. So YANG models, if you know about SNMP in the past we had like MIP modules with SNMP. Now we have YANG models with netconf or RESTconf for configuration. Now, since we realized we would see a tsunami of YANG models coming, and this is confirmed, by the way, then we asked for help. And as a consequence, I was asked to refocus my time in the IESG mainly on YANG models. With more than 240 YANG models now across all working groups in the IETF, that's a lot. So what I've been doing for the last 2 years is only focusing on YANG and related protocols. You'll see a couple of working groups I can take care of. Now, it means that I've been having a couple of working groups that we gave away to non-operational area directors. So the one I mentioned, AAA, LMAP, and Anima. And what I want to mention at the bottom also is this IESG statement that we should stop doing writable MIP modules. At some point in time in the past, there was like a thinking that every single working group should have a way to configure its technologies with MIP modules. In practice, writable MIP modules are not implemented. They are difficult to implement. It costs a lot. And the new way to do that is with netconf, RESTconf, and YANG. Now, if you don't believe me yet, that we've got many YANG modules in the IETF, this is like the dependency graph of all the YANG models. The font is small on purpose because it's not for you to read every single YANG modules. If you want, I would be happy that you do.
Please don't.
I'm trying to attract resources here. So, okay, please do. And now, if you're not convinced yet that we've got many young models in the industry, this is the graph. The issue we have right now is that all these models, they come at the same time. They should be working together, and we should standardize them as soon as possible. This is the justification why 180 has to focus on young, not only for the ops, but for all the working groups. And we see many of those young modules coming from routing in the IETF, but also from Broadband Forum, MEF, IEEE, OpenConfig, Open Daylight, SysRepo, etc. Yes?
It's not vendor specific, it's still some, well, other from organizations.
This one, I believe, I have to check. I believe these are also the vendor specific one. But now that I'm thinking about, I believe it still look nice if I put all the vendor specific, which are hundreds and hundreds. So let me double check, because if I put the vendor specific to be just a black circle.
Yeah, that would be the fully completed Death Star as opposed to this one, which is partially completed.
Okay. Now, the thing is, the vendor-specific one are somehow in a different bucket, because I don't expect them to work completely with the standard ones, right? Either you go with standard ways to configure models, or with native ones, as we call them, from vendors, and those are generated from internal databases or CLI, etc. Now, I'm not sure how many of you have been to many IETF meetings, but maybe it's good to take a minute or two to review how to look at the working groups, which documents they're covering, and what the topics are. So the first thing is you take the data tracker, and in this example, we're going to take the netconf working group and use it in the URL. And you got another one for tools. So typically, you would have something like this. This is a charter. So let me just stand up. All right, so you see the charter tab over there. This is what it gives you. So if you want to get any information from the chairs, you've got the two email addresses from the chairs at this level, the area director. The first thing you want to do maybe is subscribe to the mailing list over there. I like the dependency there that shows you all the different documents are dependent on each other. So if you want to be involved, that's maybe one thing you want to do. There is also, depending the wiki or the issue tracker, which might be different per document. Now, and maybe start with just looking at the charter, and at the bottom of the charter, you get the milestones with what the documents are. Yes. And typically, you would see, like, on the left-hand side, documents, then the last time it was updated, if a document exists, if it's a working document, if it's, what is the status, i.e. its evaluation, the AD and the document shepherd, which is most of the time a chair looking at a document to make sure it's complete before sending that to the IETF last call. Yeah, that's about it. Next one. Oops. There we go. All right, so any questions so far? It's all clear. And you're going to contribute to ops and start writing documents tonight, this afternoon.
Reviewing them is even better.
That's right, actually. Now, let me go one slide per working group. The first one is netconf. That stands for, it's a question for you. You've been paying attention. Thank you. Network configuration. So this is where we provide the protocols to manage, to configure devices with netconf and resconf. And we just finished the netconf, the resconf RFC, which is in the RFC queue, just waiting to get an RFC ID. This is where we do the encoding, JSON or HTML. HTML with netconf, or JSON or HTML with resconf. Now, what are we working on? Well, event notifications, a way to push the data, pops up, like telemetry, sending the data all the time. We've got 4 drafts on that. So since you won't be writing ops document, you might want to review those, right, and provide feedback. We're working on Yang models for managing netconf and resconf with TLS, SSH, client, server, key store. And we've got a way to do a call home. So I'm trying to give you bullet points on what we're working on to try to get your interest and quickly see the overview of different working groups. Now, in the NetMod 1, that's a netconf data modeling language. We've been defining Yang 1.0 as a language itself and Yang 1.1. And we have in there a couple of Yang models. So the rule is like this. If there is a specific working group that's define a specific technology, ideally we want to have the Yang models in that working group. Now we've got a couple of common Yang models like access list or syslog, or actually the routing one has got a long history, has just been published as an RFC. And since at that time, no working group other than ops wanted to do Yang models, that's where we started with the routing Yang model. The hot topics, we've got 2. And I hope to get a lot of progress this week. The first one is schema mount. That's a mechanism to combine Yang modules into schema defined in other Yang modules. Well, the idea is in devices, I might have a VRF, right? Routing instance. Does it mean that I should define all my Yang models with a /VRF at the top? Maybe not, because I also have devices that don't have a VRF. The idea would be, can I just take one part of a Yang module and just mount it into a different structure? So it's going to allow flexibility of integrating schema in different Yang modules. Now, and by the way, we've got many Yang models depending on this specific point. The other one is a revised conceptual model for Yang data stores. The idea here is that we have some operators who would like to manage their device differently by telling, let me push a configuration. This is my intended status, intended configuration. Then I want to listen on a regular basis if it's applied. So intended versus apply, as opposed to netconf, for example, which is I'm going to send the config and wait until it's applied, and I receive the OK. To do that, the idea is to have 2 different views of the same data, intended and apply. That's what they're doing in that design team. I'm hoping to get a lot of progress on this one. The Lime working group. Layer independent OEM management in the multi-layer environment. Okay, let me repeat that. Layer independent OEM management in the multi-layer environment. There, what we're doing is that we realize that we have many different OEM mechanisms, right? And the goal is to have, again, Yang models to have a consistent configuration of the different OEM mechanism, a consistent reporting of the data, and consistent representation of the data. If we would have that, that would be perfect. Regardless of the OEM mechanism, I have this superset of Yang models that would just configure what's happening below. The status, getting there. I hope that we won't be meeting at the next IETF in Chicago because the work will be done. So again, that's a good place to provide feedback on the document. And that's a good reminder, Greg, that it should be done. Small message. So the SUPA working group. Now, you know, in management, what we always like, we want to monitor things, but in terms of configuration, there is always like policies. If I see this traffic, I'm going to block it. If I see this traffic, I'm going to rate limit it. If I see this specific security feature, if I see this entry, it takes that routing path, etc. Now, the idea behind SUPA, simplified use of policy abstraction, is to define the policy construct, the if-then statement. Because most of the Yang modules will have those policies: QoS, access list, routing, services, you name it. Now, in the charter, there is like the metric for success will be whenever those policy construct defined in this working group in Yang models will be reused by different people, right? This is the metric for success. Now, I mentioned no intent. I should have a T there. No intent means that in this working group, we're not going to say, I want my network to behave like this. And the network just behaves magically. It's not part of this charter, even if there was some interest to do so. I would prefer to fix first the if-then scenario, and maybe later on see if intent could be standardized. I want to speak about a concluded working group. And we closed that working group just a couple of days ago. So it's a service Yang model. Do you know what a service Yang model is? All right, what is this?
Well, so you have a particular facility that you've described with this model, from provisioning through operation and so on. And so this particular one is for layer 3 VPN, but you could imagine service Yang models for a firewall function, or for L2 VPN, or for a network overlay, or underlay, or some kind of policy enforcement mechanism.
Very good answer. Thank you for the introduction. So actually, the way I describe this is on top of what Joel said. Is we have two types of service of Yang models. The one on the network elements. I want to configure interface, a VRF, an access list, etc. on specific devices. The service one typically will be in a controller or an orchestrator saying, I want to have a service on top of different devices. In this case of L3 VPN, I'm going to configure the customer edge router, provider edge, and customer edge. And then this service will have a look at the topology, and then with the orchestrator and controller that knows the topology will go in different individual devices, right? Now, another characteristic is that those service models are done by operators, because this is basically an operator asking the question to his customer. Do you want to have IPv4 and IPv6? Which routing do you want to have between your CE and your PE? What type of QoS? Now, I mean by this, it's not like I'm going to have in this service model all the configuration knobs that the specific device could do. No, just a question asked by the operator to his customer. Now, L2SM is basically L3SM, which is closed for an L2 VPN this time. So same thing. Question, yes?
Yeah. Not about layer 3, but layer 2SM macro Ethernet form, so they do have their service model, which is
MEF.
MEF.
Yeah, MEF. So they have MEF service model for the carrier Ethernet. How that is.
So the question, to repeat this for the recording, is what is the interaction with MEF, which has got also some service models? Yes, it was discussed. The MEF wants to have an architecture with different building blocks there for a service, for customer database, for billing, for all this. And we're going to work with MEF on this. So we've been reviewing what they're doing. We're also reviewing. I'm believing that in the world of service model, it will be somehow difficult. Okay, let me rephrase that. We're not going to have that many service model standardized. A couple of them. I start to see new service model all the times. Now, the approach is different between the IETF and MEF. In the IETF, we want to have a self-contained model. In the MEF, they want to have the full architecture.
So L2SM is brand new.
It's
Now
the
that-
first meeting,
yeah.
yes. And I will be quick, yes. Question?
I don't really see the difference between a young model called service for configuration time. So what is the real difference, because you're asking for parameters?
So you have a situation where you may have a multi-vendor environment, but you're also stepping up from say the point of bare metal interface configuration to the abstraction, i.e. What I'm provisioning is an L2 VPN service, and so we describe that to a controller, and then controller goes off with the device or interface models and actually takes that abstraction and has to implement that mechanically, which means producing configuration essentially for these devices that are involved. So you want to step away from the vendor-specific notion of how this thing actually gets configured to a sort of higher level abstraction that describes the features of it that are required for provisioning.
Typically, you would be asking something like, okay, I want to have quality of service, gold. You're not going to define specifically, oh, I want to have a queue depth of X. You're not going to discuss that with your customer on the line, right? You're going to say, which one do you want? That's the level of abstraction that Joel speaks about.
I understand that, but there is no fundamental structure of young models.
No, it's not in the structure itself. It's
Yeah.
just like different positioning on top of a controller orchestrator for multiple devices. Yes.
But at least for the carrier Ethernet, the model they have defines the SLA, which is characterized by packet loss, latency, jitter parameters. So how the device go to what you mentioned as a packet depth or div-serve mapping of the bits, that is, at least for MEF, it's outside the scope, because their scope on CPE. So would that be different scope for L2SM? So would that be more scope of PE rather than CPE?
I don't think so, but I don't think that the L2SM will go into the L2SM will not go into the SLA.
Because, for example,
Maybe you want to go to the mic if it's a long comment.
sure, you're right. So,
one of the points of the MEF is that they specify the service, they don't specify how it's implemented. For example, for IETF, that will be whether it's EVPN or it's EVPLS, the pseudowires, that might be part of the model, but it would not be definitely part of the MEF model, because for them, it's an E-line or EVPL or E3.
it's pretty important for these industries to be able to describe the product that they're delivering in a relatively coherent fashion so that we all agree that we're using the same thing. And I think that's where sort of these higher level constructs come from.
Yeah, but
the desire for them.
What I wonder is that would you expect that L2SM will have defined the mechanism which implements layer 2 service, whether it will say, okay, we do EVPN, and you can go into their EVPN data model, and it will address your concern. Or we'll say we use VPLS, and then you go into VPLS data model, and it provides you how to build layer 2 service.
So in the charter, we say pseudo-wire.
Which
so
could be a lot of those things.
It's not EVPN then?
And EVPN is in there as well.
Yeah, I mean, it could be a lot of those things. Like pseudo-wire covers a whole bunch of technologies, either in the IETF or elsewhere.
So would then that these models of this specific technology to instantiate the layer 2 service be exposed in L2SM?
So we sent a charter. I'm trying to access it, but I can't. That it should be based on pseudo-wire and EVPN, if I'm not mistaken. But it's not like a configuration of those two. It's based on. Let's review the charter text.
Okay.
Yeah, I can.
And if you recall, I've got there are 4 different working groups that are not that are in ops, but not managed by ops. So I'll be quick on those. I want to mention the ops directorate. That's a group of experts in ops who could help you if you've got an ops issue. But also, what they're doing is that they're reviewing all the working group documents at IETF last call. So this is the ops directorate. You can also send them directly a request if you've got any questions. And you've got like some more directorates for young doctors, mid doctors. If you've got like a young module or a mid module at IETF last call, they're going to review this document. From a young point of view, from a SMI point of view, which is the MIP language, but not specifically if you're managing your technology right, because it's difficult to be an expert in management, but also on the technologies themselves, right? So let's pretend that you want to manage X25. A good example. Then maybe what you want, you can't be the expert in Yang and MIPS at the same time, X25. And we've got 2 more, like the AAA doctors and the performance metric directorates. Now, if you want, the last thing I want to say is we've got the ops open hours every single time at the IETF. We are available for any questions you have, specific new work or anything that relates to the ops area. This is tomorrow at 3:50. So we just ask you to book in advance for us because you've got many requests. Now, this is the end of my part. Any questions for me? I will have to leave now for next meeting, even if Joel can answer any questions.
Well, I can make stuff up, certainly. Good at that.
All right. Thank you.
Good. So Benoit talked over the management side of things. I have the ops in operations and management. IETF areas are typically organized around particular lines of work. So routing, internet, transport, applications. Real-time applications was a separate area for a while, and it's been folded back into the general application and real-time area, and even management protocols. Operations, however, is kind of a meta area in the sense that it actually touches a whole bunch of the other areas. The general rubric of that is network operators used to be a somewhat more general purpose entity. If you worked at CompuServe or AOL or an entity like that, you had a tendency to have operations in sort of all of the areas. And as networks have become more application specific, whereas they've fallen out into transport and services and eyeball networks and so on, operations has tended to get a little bit more diffuse and divide up into more specific groups. The operations area in the IETF still touches all of them, however. So largely we're concerned with the operation of IETF protocols. There is overlap with other organizations, so we occasionally have liaisons, for example, with IEEE or 3GPP related to particular lines of work in the IETF, and particularly in relation to the operation of, say, the IPv6 protocol or CAPWAP extensions to IEEE 802.11. Are places where we are outwardly facing. So the IETF didn't start with an operations area. It actually sort of evolved out of a need to have a place to do work for working groups where the actual protocol development was actually completed or largely completed and in a maintenance mode. Sharing and coordination with operators is a necessary part of protocol utilization. So just because the IETF thinks they're done with something doesn't mean that it is actually particularly easy to operate, or that we don't benefit from sharing the insights of operators back with the developers of these protocols. So operations tries to fill that hole. The big places that we do that, the sort of top line divisions among the working groups tend to be routing coordination, security coordination, measurement, and so on. But we also catch a few other things. Operations working groups typically do not do protocol development. So there are exceptions to that, but in general, we do not do maintenance on existing protocols, with exceptions for elements in the DNS that are largely operationally focused, like new resource record types. Coordination with protocols developers is a lot simpler in areas where there are active working groups doing work. So interdomain routing, for example, in the routing area has an excellent dovetail with the global routing operations working group. Maintaining critical mass is a challenge for some operations area working groups. So some of these things span decades because we don't get to just declare victory and go home in some cases. So part of what the responsibility of an area director and the working group chairs is to judge where there are critical levels of activity and or kill off areas where we're no longer doing a good job, or where we lack critical mass or interest for the IETF to still be engaged in those activities. But some activity levels are cyclical. So protocols will go through periodic demand for change or usable input, and then the level of activity will drop off again for a couple of years. So that means we have to not be afraid to charter new work just because it might not work out. Sometimes we have to make working groups dormant and then find new chairs when the level of activity works up. There is a tendency among operators to think of protocol developers as some form of subhuman. It's kind of important to not make the operator developer relationship into us versus them kind of stance, and we try and maintain that in the operations area. In many cases, the participants in the working group and the authors of documents come from both sides of the fence. So developers come here because they need feedback, and operators and consumers come here because they have problems and because they have ideas on how things can improve. So we try and do this together. The IETF operations area, I think, serves an important function, and this is one of the key focuses of the operations directorate in performing review, is to look at other IETF work with an eye towards its operation and management considerations. So this comes up in the charter of, for example, new working groups. So something that is very important right now in terms of IETF activities was the chartering and the beginning of the effort on the QUIC protocol. Now that HTTP2 is done, there is a significant amount of interest and effort looking at the QUIC protocol, and one of the things that we as operators are concerned about with the QUIC protocol is the potential for loss of visibility into things like flows that are necessary for the operation of devices like firewalls, for IP flow export to work properly, and for us to have visibility into traffic on our networks. So we review the QUIC charter, and we get some text added, which I think actually speaks to the manageability of the IP protocols in general, and is maybe a feature of them, but was not actually a design consideration back in the early 80s. There's been a significant amount of work in the area of how do we provide guidelines to protocol developers on what operational issues are, and how management should be done in the rest of the IETF. So you can see in Benoit's efforts around Yang, that effort bearing fruit, because operators do need tools in this space. So it was no longer sufficient in the IETF to just do protocols and not do management interfaces, for example, for them, because the operator community has to knit all these pieces together, and that becomes harder over time. To look at the current set of working groups that we have, we're actually going to go through all these real quick, so we can just go into that. Benchmark Methodology Working Group. I think this is the oldest working group that I have currently. It's been operational since 1989. It was started by a guy named Scott Bradner, who many of you might be familiar with. But at Harvard, he had a thing called the Bradner Lab, which did Ethernet switch benchmarking. And so he brought a great deal of levity and sanity to the measurement of forwarding performance in routers and switches. And yep.
Being in the vendor side and being involved in prepping their box to the Bradner Lab, I have some interesting history. What vendors did to get the numbers.
Oh yes, absolutely.
And that's actually why I wonder, is just your opinion, how much value operators put in the benchmarking numbers?
So I think, and this actually speaks to sort of the IETF as not being internet protocol police. I think what benchmarking methodology gave us was common language to describe the properties of things. So I have a tendency to not take seriously numbers that I see published in magazines, because the circumstances under which they are created obviously have, can be viewed with some suspicion. On the other hand, I can use the language that the IETF has given me and that the tools that benchmarking methodology gave me to compare the performance of devices and at least talk about when they deviate from my expectations, for example, what it was that actually happened. So, obviously, as vendors, and I have actually worked at a firewall vendor, so I have some direct experience with, say, TCP IMEX performance funging. I think we could say as vendors that, like, and as consumers of this technology, that that actually did have real value, because if they were all making it up themselves, we'd be even worse off than we are now. So, and I mean, this has continued to evolve. There are all sorts of things that people care about performance aspects of, not just forwarding performance. So router convergence, for example, are things where it's helpful to be able to have a common language to describe them. And the RFC series through BMWG in the last 30 years has actually done a pretty, I think, decent job there. And it, of course, covers things other than routing and forwarding performance. So SIP, traffic management, neighbor discovery, virtual network functions are all things that have been done there. DNSOP. We used to essentially have two working groups where lots of DNS work was done. DNSX, which was DNS extensions, and that was in the internet area, and DNSOP, which had a tendency to handle behavioral changes that DNS operators wanted. Now we just have one, so we have DNSOP. And so that actually simplifies things a little. In other ways, it makes it more complex. This is another place where outward-looking outreach efforts are done. So, for example, the IETF has responsibility for the technical operation of the root zone, not for the contents of it. Or the management of how things get in or out, and so that puts us in an interesting position with respect to managing, for example, .ARPA, where the reverse zone is, and the community around that is organized around DNSOP. So this provides an interface for other constituencies. They can come here. And work with the IETF on the technical problems associated with this area. GROW is global routing operations. And so this essentially exists as a companion to IDR in the routing area. And it documents issues and operational practices with BGP, routing table size, IGP interaction, security, and VPNs. And it works on best practices for configuration and problem statements. So, for example, if you see something about route flap dampening being considered harmful, it probably came through GROW, right? Route flap dampening is, of course, not an IETF technology. It was a vendor-specific implementation, which everyone slavishly copied from Cisco, because it actually, does essentially what it was intended to do, which was reduce CPU utilization. On the other hand, it needs some bumpers to make it safe. And so that's a place where operators provided feedback to implementers through the GROW working group on that. MBOND, contrary to some people's expectations, multicast routing actually still has quite a viable lifespan, even if it's not the inter-domain promise of the early 90s for multicast routing. So That work is coordinated among operators, and it also has a companion routing working group, which is the PIM working group. Operations and management area. This is an important working group. It's our catch-all working group. The ops, AWG, and operations area meetings are code-joined. We have chairs here. We have a sufficiently broad enough charter that we can take on operations work or almost anything in the operations space without having to charter a new working group. So it's nice to have a place to stuff things. That does mean that at any given time it may be working on some unrelated technologies. The other thing that we do there is maintenance of legacy management components. So things like MIBs that need to go away or get marked historical or deprecated, and things that might potentially be dangerous that we should get rid of from the IETF protocol specifications. Occasionally come there. And things like MIBs that might be informational that don't justify spinning up a dedicated working group tend to get housed there. So that meeting can actually be interesting as a smorgasbord, but it's also a place where you might potentially bring work if you don't have an idea where it actually should go. And that is actually a good place, a good opportunity to talk to either the working group chairs or the area directors about whether the operations and management area working group is the right place to put work. OPSEC does essentially the same thing except for security specific work. And it develops recommendations and best practices for the operation of things like control plane policers or control plane ACLs or default firewall postures, things like that. CIDR Ops is actually newly chartered. This is my first new working group in a year. And it essentially takes on the remaining work of the CIDR working group as that is closing down because it has completed the core specification for CIDR. So interdomain routing, again, in the internet area is sort of a companion to this in the sense that that's where BGP-SEC protocol work is going on right now. But now that we have a CIDR specification, the operation of secure interdomain routing and the RPKI is going to be a thing that is quite involved as far as deployment goes because it has a number of constituent parties. And its operation has not yet matured significantly. So, you know, we needed a place where that stuff could cook. And so it starts with a whole stable of documents in sort of intermediate stages related to the operation of various components of the RPKI. And finally, we have V6 Ops. And this exists as a companion to the Internet Area Group 6-man, which does the protocol maintenance for the IPv6 protocol stack. And this concerns itself with the operations and deployment of IPv6 networks. And so that's what it's focused on. And finally, that means we've made it to the end here in good time. So there is a survey. I'll leave this slide up for a little bit if you want it, but it's also in the set of slides and will be in the agenda. So if you want to offer us feedback, that's useful for the education, the EDU team. They can't get rid of me because I'm an area director, but it would be useful to them to know if this was useful for you. And if there are any questions, you can either bring them to the mic or bring them to me directly once we've closed this down. Cool. Thank you. Hey, how's it going? Are you with? Are you an ISAC fellow this time?
Yeah.
Good. Excellent.
But I was looking for this fellowship training
Mhm.
is a risk with interesting.
Mhm.
I was after get the chance. And then I got this chance and I think that one of the areas like we're working on this capacity. So we have working groups, infrastructure discussions.
Yep.
So first thing I would love if you send me the presentation.
Yep. Yeah, we can do that. This one is also this one will also be online if it's not already. But yeah, I can totally send it to you.
Yeah. And